Trisha was just a beautiful person. She would make you feel special.
She loved me and a mom more than anything, and we definitely loved having her as our mom.
That's where they're gonna come from. Your shots are coming from over that tree.
Galen was sure of himself, very confident, and that's what Trisha was attracted to.
Trisha went nowhere without Galen's approval. Galen set the stage for everyone in his life. We were the characters in his play.
She was almost like a prisoner.
A car chase in Centennial this afternoon.
It was due to a massive car accident.
Something catastrophic happened in that truck.
Santa brought me a new hairdryer.
Trisha was a really good friend and really good mom. She cared about the people in her life. Galen was 10 years older than Trisha.
He was well known, he was well liked, he was a man of the community, and that was something that Trisha really liked. Galen made her feel like a princess, and that there was nobody else in this world but her.
Trisha and I were born on May 7th, 1975. Trisha was born first by 6 minutes. She never let me live that down.
The twins are raised in Sunfield, Michigan by single mother Beverly and have 3 older siblings.
My dad was not there when Trisha and I were born. And as the years went on, we saw less and less of him. Trisha and I were country girls. We rode bikes together. We played outside together. She was very quiet, very shy. I led her around by the hand and protected her.
Everybody knew everybody, and everybody knew the Green Twins.
It's 1992, and Trisha and Terry attend their junior prom.
Look at this! Don't you guys look pretty?
Very excited to be going to prom.
The following year, 17-year-old Trisha meets Brian Briggs.
They started dating, and they were like inseparable.
Trish and I graduated in June of 1993, and then in November, she married Brian.
Brian joins the Army, and in 1994, he's stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado.
Trisha was apprehensive to leave the only home she ever knew, to leave the family, to leave everything.
On March 13th, 1995, Trisha gives birth to her first son.
CJ was the light of her life.
Oh, what do I got?
Mom was a playful parent. She was always like that, even to me as a grown adult. She never lost that side of her.
When CJ was approximately 3 years old, Trish and Brian began having marital issues.
She loved Brian, and so they made it work.
He's tired. Look at him. He's sleeping.
Noah was born in 2000. I believe that Trisha thought that having this other baby would help strengthen the marriage.
Everybody sit down.
Mama Santa.
There is no Mama Santa.
Yeah, Mama Santa Claus.
It's Christmas 2005, and Brian films Trisha and the boys opening gifts.
Okay, Mama Santa this year. Okay, then Noah's my elf.
I believe that Trisha stayed in her marriage to Brian because she truly felt that you get married once.
You're really, really gonna like this one, Dad.
Oh, yeah.
She did not want her boys separated from their dad, even though she was not happy.
After Noah was born, Trisha started working as a title clerk at Douglas County DMV.
In 2006, while at work, Tricia meets local businessman Galen Westfall.
At the time Tricia met Galen, he was working for a large trash company. He would come into the DMV almost every day, asking to take her to lunch. She was flattered. There was a person in her life giving her attention.
My mom was a vibrant, happy person, and she was just so approachable. It's not hard to see why someone could have been attracted to her.
He wanted her, and he was going to have her no matter what the cost.
Galen Westfall was born September 13, 1964, and was raised in a middle-class family in Castle Rock, Colorado.
His family was from the area for generations and owned most of the land in Castle Rock. Galen was an avid hunter, avid gun enthusiast. He would hunt bear. Anything that was a guided hunt, he would hunt.
Better not point that this way, you break your lens.
Galen met his ex-wife on a hunt, and Galen's daughter was born in 2006. At the time Tricia and Galen met, they were both living with their respective spouse.
And Tricia and Brian's marriage, things were not great. So when Galen would come in, he would make her feel good. She felt wanted. He just didn't care what the collateral damage would be. And pursuing a married woman, on top of him being in a relationship, there were no boundaries. She had asked him to stop, but Galen didn't stop. Galen came in, Galen would send flowers. Galen would not take no for an answer. Brian and Tricia's marriage was pretty much over. Galen was trying to help her out and find her a place to live, place to rent, and I think eventually they started to get closer.
In 2007, Tricia travels to Michigan to spend Thanksgiving with her family.
She came home with the boys, and at this time, Tricia was getting ready to possibly move out of the home that she shared with Brian.
She had said she was pretty sure the marriage was over, but she did think, maybe we should give it one last try. She's there for a few days, and then out of the blue, she gets a phone call from Galen stating that he was boarding a plane and was coming to Michigan to see her.
Tricia was not happy about that situation. She just said, he's coming, and he's not supposed to be here. The night that Galen arrived in Michigan, we went to Connections Comedy Club in Lansing. I think Tricia was uncomfortable with the fact that he showed up in Michigan when she told him not to.
Sitting there at the comedy club, I was watching my friend feel very awkward. Galen was very touchy-feely, all over her, putting his arm around her, pulling her close, and you could tell she was uncomfortable. Galen would not take no for an answer. He was going to have Tricia. Tricia was going to be his. I look back on that day and I wish I could tell my friend to run.
On her return to Colorado after 14 years together, Tricia officially divorces Brian.
I believe that Galen had a hand in that decision.
I do not think Tricia ever called him out on coming to Michigan unannounced. I think Tricia thought somebody really, really liked her and just couldn't be without her. I don't think she saw the red flags.
In the wake of the divorce, Galen offers Tricia and the boys a home to rent that belongs to his friend.
We moved into the new property when I was 13. That was where we also first met Galen. He was just introduced to us as a friend. He had an office in the second story of the house that he would conduct all of his business out of. We would see him fairly often.
At that time, Galen was still living with his partner and his daughter. But he pursued Trisha. He gave her a home, gave her all of this stuff at a very low cost that she could afford. He had eyes on Trisha 24/7. He knew who was coming to Trisha's house. He knew who was leaving Trisha's house. He knew everything about Trisha.
A few months later, Galen and Trisha officially begin dating. And by September 2008, he's living with Trisha and the boys.
I think Trisha was excited about her new future. I do believe she kind of thought she was on the right path. Like, life was going to be okay.
Stick his head between your fingers and snap it off.
How?
I showed you.
Galen would take us out hunting, and that was one of the ways that he would bond with us.
That's where they're gonna come from. Your shots are coming from over that tree, Bennett.
I think that Galen believed that if he befriended CJ and Noah, that he would have absolute control over their mom.
Galen now owns a waste disposal business.
Galen started his company, and it was a fairly successful business.
A little bit. She's like, oh, it'll be fine. No biggies. And I was like, okay.
More hunting gear.
All right. Oh, cool.
It's Christmas morning, 2008, and Galen and Trisha's first holiday season as an engaged couple.
What? This?
Yeah.
Galen
No,
has
that
one?
other one. I don't play with dolls. The gun.
Oh, this?
Noah never took a particular interest in hunting and shooting guns like I had, so Galen did grow frustrated because it was working with me, but it wasn't working with him.
Yeah, the gun.
This is not a doll.
Galen was very good at reading a room, knowing where people's emotions were at any moment and where he could step in and control that situation.
Santa brought me a new hairdryer.
Woohoo! He's awful good. He must have figured out that yours broke.
In 2009, Galen and Trisha make things official.
Galen and Trisha traveled to Mexico in September of 2009 to sign their marriage license.
Back in Castle Rock, the newlyweds throw a lavish wedding party in the backyard of one of Galen's wealthy friends. The following year, Terry and her husband moved from Michigan to Colorado.
In 2010, my husband was let go from his job after a motorcycle accident. Trisha and Galen owned a waste disposal business, and they offered for my husband and I to come out, and Galen would teach us how to run the business. And in a year's time, if we wanted to, we could buy the business from them.
I believe that when Galen approached Terry and Scott about moving to Colorado, that was a total control move. It was all for Trisha. It was to make sure that he could monitor everything that was going on, even in the relationship with her twin.
It was not very often that I had time alone with Trisha. Galen was always somewhere. It was very clear that the marriage was already rocky.
In 2011, Galen loans Terry and her husband the money to buy the business.
The contract to buy this business was a 5-year installment loan. Galen's behavior changed when we paid off the company at 2.5 years instead of 5. There was a dispute on the remaining amount. Galen believed that we still owed several $1,000s. Galen began to make up anything, any kind of lie he could. Galen had to have ultimate power and control, not only over Trisha, but over everyone. Trish and I did not speak for a year and a half because of this situation. Galen absolutely wanted to separate Trish and I so he could control Trisha. I lost a year and a half of my life with my sister. Every time CJ came over, he would say, "Let's call Mom." Eventually, CJ wore me down, and I did. Galen and Trisha came to dinner, and everybody pretended that it never happened.
Hi, I've been nominated by Deb Mason to do the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. I am going to nominate my sons, CJ and Noah Briggs.
Causes like this were at the center of Trisha's heart.
I'm ready. Oh my God.
That same month, CJ joins the Army.
Yeah, Trisha, look at his sausage wrapping.
So Christmas of 2014, CJ was home on leave. We spent Christmas as a family in our home. Galen always kind of stood back and surveilled a situation. Galen always knew where Trisha was at, whether she left a room or was in the room with him. He always knew where she was.
In January of 2017, Trisha makes a rare trip back to Michigan.
Trisha came to Michigan for the boys' great-grandma's funeral, and she was staying with me. Galen was on the phone with Trisha 90% of that trip. Galen called her from the time we woke up about every 2 hours. He was so worried about her being in Michigan, even for like 72 hours. And so she flew home, and that was the last time Trisha came to Michigan.
Galen's business is doing better than ever, and on Trisha's return, he decides it's time to upgrade their home.
In 2017, they moved to the Kryptonite Lane house. We went from having a 1,300 square foot house in total to a house with well over 4,000 square feet.
When you walked into this big, beautiful house, when you went downstairs, it was all weapons, all guns, ammo, tools to make your own ammo. It was just eerie. I mean, I know people that collect guns, and I get all of that, but this was different. You got a different feeling in there. You felt controlled when you were down there.
In 2019, Galen called me and expressed that he believed Trisha was going to leave him once Noah graduated high school. He became more obsessed, controlling, manipulative over Trisha's life.
Noah moved out before he graduated. He moved in to my dad's house full-time.
I believe Galen was jealous of Noah. Galen treated Noah poorly because he knew that Noah was Trisha's baby. I believe the emotional abuse inflicted on Noah by Galen is why Noah left. Trisha was devastated. It was just another step in isolation and manipulation of Trisha. I think that Trisha stayed with Galen because she felt trapped. Galen made her feel as though she did not have the ability to stand on her own 2 feet.
In March 2020, COVID hits, and the world shuts down.
Trisha's job was all she had. It was her only reprieve from a constant monitoring.
Not being able to go to work destroyed her. She was absolutely miserable being home with Galen 24/7. I think she had decided that she was unhappy. She wasn't free. I think at that point is when 12 years kicked her in the face and said, "You're a prisoner." In October 2021, Galen said that a lady had called that worked with Trisha and had stated that Trisha was having an extramarital affair at her job.
Galen contacted Arapahoe County HR and filed a complaint in regards to what he believed Trisha was doing at work. Galen's intentions of going to Arapahoe County HR was to get Trisha fired. He wanted Trisha home with him, under his control, 24/7.
HR concluded that nothing was found, there was no wrongdoing on their part. That's when Galen totally spun. He was gonna do anything in his power to still have control.
9 days later, Trisha and Galen traveled to Mexico for their annual vacation.
I think she was just biding her time and agreeing to go and do these things to surpass him until she could get all of her ducks in a row.
I truly believe that Trisha was leaving Galen. It was just how quickly she could gather the means to be okay on her own.
8 days after they returned from Mexico, Trisha and Terry prepare for the holidays.
So on November 13th, Trisha and I went Christmas shopping. Trisha came over the following day and Galen was with her, and they got ready to leave, and nothing seemed abnormal. And I yelled at her, "I love you." She turned and looked at me, and as she was closing the door, she said, "I love you too."
Arapahoe County 911, what's the address of your emergency?
I am across the street from Geddes Avenue.
Okay, what's going on?
There was due to a massive car accident.
Car chase in Centennial this afternoon. It happened around 3:30. The Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office said that 2 people were found inside a vehicle, both of them dead.
On November 15, 2021, at 3:35 p.m., Arapahoe County Dispatch is alerted to a traffic accident.
Witnesses observed a pickup truck leaving the roadway, hitting an unoccupied pickup truck at a very high rate of speed, and finally coming to rest after colliding with another unoccupied vehicle.
South Metro Fire and Rescue arrived on scene fairly quickly. Upon assessing the occupants of that truck, they determined that there was a female in the passenger seat, and there was also a male driver inside the pickup truck. Paramedics did determine both victims to be deceased at the scene.
So guys, I'm gonna have everybody start backing up. We're gonna crime scene this off if you guys don't mind, please.
Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office investigator Chelsea Young tries to determine what caused the black pickup to crash.
This doesn't make any sense right now. I wonder if that pickup just got hit in the process.
That's what we were thinking too.
Because that would make me feel a little bit better that we're not missing something.
She was like crunched underneath the, in between the seat and the dash.
Did you see?
I opened the door and she fell out.
The female occupant fell out of the vehicle onto the ground, at which point they noticed a firearm also had fallen out of the vehicle and was on the ground next to her.
She shot herself.
Looks like a gunshot, doesn't it? Where's the gun though?
Right in her lap.
Okay.
It appeared that there was a vertical gunshot wound over her left eye.
Is there a gunshot within? Two?
The male behind the steering wheel had a gunshot wound across his head. It appeared to enter from the right side and exit from the left side.
We have a GSW involving this accident.
Upon finding 2 deceased victims with gunshot wounds, the death investigation opens up and a wide variety of possibilities come to play.
Were they subject to something like a road rage shooting? Was it some sort of conflict with another driver?
Are there any surveillance cameras on the building or anything?
We don't have any. Did you guys look in any vehicles, touch anything like that?
I was inside the building and my boss told me about it.
Okay.
The deputies spoke with several witnesses, both from vehicles that were on the roadway traveling, as well as folks in a nearby apartment complex that heard the crash.
And you saw most of it?
Well, what happened is I was coming down the hill, and all I seen was all the debris just kind of just still moving.
Yeah.
So I turned here, went up, and then as I seen it, I go, what the heck? And I seen about 3 guys coming out of the building. So we all, I parked and we got out, and then we were like, is anybody, some guys ran to the white truck to see if that one was okay. One guy was looking in the Jeep, and then me and another guy were looking in the truck, and we were like, hello. So the guy just kind of pulled the airbag up, and we had seen them, and we were like, they're really bad, they're really, really bad. So
one party indicated that they tried to. There were empty shell casings that were found on the floorboard of the truck, and one behind the passenger seat. There was a bullet hole found on the passenger door. It indicated that the projectile was fired from inside the vehicle from left to right. The driver more than likely fired that shot. Was this a murder-suicide, or was this a suicide pact, in which case they had shot themselves relating to something that was going on in their relationship? Investigators also learned from co-workers that Galen had indicated that Tricia wanted a divorce and move on. Galen indicated that he did not want to divorce Tricia and that he actually wanted her to quit her job. It certainly started giving us a potential motive as to why this incident occurred.
Investigators want to trace Tricia's final steps.
The DMV has a number of exterior security cameras that we are able to access. You can see Galen arrives in the Chevy Silverado, parks on the side of the DMV. Tricia leaves her workplace at approximately 3:30 p.m. Gets into the passenger side door. The vehicle pulls away.
And in the next 4 minutes, something catastrophic happened in that truck.
Investigators visit Galen's workplace to try and track Galen's movements earlier that day.
He spoke with Galen's co-workers, who told him a variety of things. They remarked on the fact that Galen showed up around like 9 or 10 a.m. They viewed Galen as very preoccupied, like something was on his mind. He showed up, said he had to go to a doctor's appointment, came back, and then again left at about 1 p.m. to go visit his parents. And then said, I had to go pick up my daughter from school. And he left the workplace at about 2:30 p.m.
He left in the general direction of the school like he normally had, but then that coworker saw him make a U-turn and head in the opposite direction away from the school, which they thought was odd. Based on that information, it indicates that potentially he was putting misinformation out there for potential witnesses.
The following day, detectives informed Terry of the incident.
I kept shaking my head at my husband and saying, he's got the wrong people. He's wrong. He's got the wrong people. It's not them. The only reason I knew that Galen and Tricia were dead was because he described Galen's truck. All I could think was, what are her boys going to do without her?
I was at work and I got a phone call from my aunt and uncle, and they told me that Mom and Galen are dead and you need to get home as soon as possible. I was informed that this was being considered a homicide and that the evidence at the time was leading to Galen being the culprit. In no point in my mind could I have ever imagined that Galen had done this. It was somebody that I trusted. It just didn't seem possible.
Rappahannock County Sheriff's Office, anybody home?
Later that morning, one of Galen's family members gives Detective Gillespie access to Galen and Tricia's home.
My intent was to see what the condition of the house was. Was there signs of a disturbance? In one corner of the basement, Galen had a variety of different firearms, different rifles, different handguns. So definitely appeared that Galen enjoyed hunting.
You didn't find any notes or anything?
No, ma'am. It's completely clean up here.
Galen's daughter arrives at the home and tells Detective Gillespie that she spoke with her father the day of the incident.
She felt her father was, quote, off that day. And Galen told his daughter he needed her to not be at the house by 4 p.m. that day, that she needed to go over to Grandma's house. And he was very emphatic in that. That led me to believe that Galen had something planned that was going to occur at that house sometime after 4 p.m.
That same day, Tricia and Galen's autopsies are conducted.
Tricia suffered 2 gunshot wounds. Galen had suffered a close contact gunshot wound to the side of his head at an angle that certainly evidenced suicide. It was concluded that Galen murdered Tricia and then committed suicide.
While Terry tries to piece together why Galen killed her sister, she searches Tricia's home security cameras.
It is eerie. The hair on the back of your neck stands up. Tricia had security cameras in the home. After just a few weeks of going through Tricia's phone, emails, I retrieved video footage from these Ring cameras, and it shows on November 6th, Tricia and Galen arriving home from Mexico. You can clearly see that things are not good. You can just tell that she does not want to be near him. They go to bed, and at about 4:30 the next morning, November 7th, Galen removes the cameras from the home. The very first camera that Galen removes is from the kitchen. He then proceeds to the laundry room, and then he takes the camera out of the cabinet that is facing the stairwell. Each time that he removes a camera, he is looking over his shoulder to see if Tricia is coming down the stairs. I believe that Galen was going to bring Tricia home that day and murder her in the home. And it's just eerie, just watching that, knowing that 8 days later, he murdered my sister.
Police discovered that on the day of Tricia's murder, a number of her co-workers received an identical suspicious message.
This text message came from an anonymous phone number.
The texter indicated that they contacted Galen, informing him about Tricia having an affair. There was now another unknown person that had information regarding Galen's accusations of infidelity.
Detectives are unable to trace the sender, but several weeks later, they make an important discovery.
I was able to meet with one of Galen's relatives. She had contacted me several weeks prior saying that she had some information.
Just, you gotta tell me some context. Events leading up to November 15th.
It's just hard for me, because I spoke with him all the time. Galen asked me to buy him a prepaid phone. He wanted me to text him what the lady told him from Tricia's office.
She revealed that prior to this murder occurring, Galen told her to go pick up an anonymous phone, and on the evening of the 15th to send out this specific text message to a bunch of co-workers.
You need to know that your wife is having an affair.
In his mind, painting a picture of Tricia cheating on him.
He wanted a text sent, a group one sent to different people, with their numbers. telling them what this lady had said. I'm like, well, I don't know how to work this. I wasn't comfortable with doing that. But, and then he was like, just send it. No, don't, I can't. And then,
was there someone else involved?
he did twice ask me, are you comfortable doing this? I told him, no, I'm not. But he was so sad.
Looking over all of the interviews, the physical evidence, the sequence of events that we were able to put together, I think Galen had come to the conclusion he really believed Trisha was having an affair. He tried to deal with that with her employer and really didn't get any satisfaction because they couldn't substantiate anything of this nature was going on. I think Galen intended to kill Trisha that day. I think that's why he told his daughter, don't come home from school. And I think everything in some ways was going to his plan until he picked her up from work and some sort of argument occurred in that truck, and I don't think he planned accordingly for that. With whatever argument that ensued in that truck in 4 minutes, causing him to take Trisha's life by shooting her twice.
I feel that Galen is the largest betrayal in my life. He's the one that destroyed my family.
Galen Westfall lost control and power over Trisha. And that is the moment he took her life. You know, Trisha always said, we're going to be those little old ladies sitting in the nursing home in the rocking chair. And he took that from me.
I miss my friend. I miss a beautiful woman that should still be here today and get to see her sons get married and have kids.
Mom's death, it's affected me a lot. There's just so much that I wish she'd still be able to do.
And I miss her every minute of every day.
No exact word count was specified in this message, so I'm giving part 1 as a long continuous opening in the style you requested. In the spring of 1932, America was a country balancing itself on tired legs. Bread lines stretched along city blocks. Banks had failed. Men who once wore pressed collars now stood for hours in worn coats waiting for work that never came. And yet, even in those anxious years, there were still a few names that seemed to belong to another kind of sky. Charles Lindbergh was one of them. To millions of Americans, he was not merely a man, but an emblem, a figure cut out of courage and modern legend. The solitary pilot who had crossed the Atlantic and stitched his name into the national imagination, his face had become familiar in newspapers. His silence interpreted as nobility, his self-possession mistaken by many for invincibility. And because the public had lifted him so high, because they had wrapped him in the kind of myth usually reserved for generals and saints, it became easy to believe that whatever belonged to Charles Lindbergh must also be protected by that same invisible armor, his home, his marriage, his child. All of it seemed to exist at a remove from ordinary danger, as if fame itself could stand guard at the door. But crime does not care about symbolism, and evil has always been drawn to the bright places where innocence appears safest. On a cold night in March, on a rise of land in rural New Jersey, that illusion would split open, inside a home that had been built for privacy. Beyond the public ceremonies and camera flashes, beyond the newspaper headlines that had followed the Lindberghs wherever they went, a nursery window stood above the dark earth. The wind moved through the trees. Rain had turned the ground soft. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and then fell silent. In houses across America, children were being tucked into bed while their parents adjusted blankets and lowered lamps and performed the small, ordinary rituals that make a family feel protected from the night. But at the Lindbergh estate, the darkness gathering outside was not empty. It was occupied by intention. It was carrying with it a plan, a ladder, a set of footsteps that did not belong there. and a violence that at first would not announce itself with blood or broken furniture or screams. It would announce itself with absence. There is a special kind of terror that comes with discovering that something precious is no longer where it should be. It begins as confusion before it becomes panic. The mind resists it. It reaches for explanation. Perhaps the child has been moved. Perhaps someone forgot to say something. Perhaps there is some simple domestic reason that will become obvious in another second. But then the seconds pass. The room remains wrong. And the silence begins to change shape. It becomes heavier. It becomes accusatory. It becomes the kind of silence that seems to know more than the people standing inside it. That is the atmosphere in which this story begins, not with courtroom transcripts or ransom notes or the machinery of law, but with that first terrible rupture in the ordinary. A baby is supposed to be asleep in his crib. A mother is supposed to be able to walk into a room and find him breathing softly under blankets. A father is supposed to fear fever, bad weather, perhaps the 1,000 harmless worries of early parenthood. Not the possibility that a stranger has reached into the center of his life and carried something away, yet on the night of March 1st. 1932, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., the 20-month-old son of one of the most famous men in the world, disappeared from his nursery in East Amwell, New Jersey, by the time the news escaped the walls of that house and entered the bloodstream of the country. It no longer belonged only to the Lindbergh family. It became an American nightmare. The details were irresistible to the press and unbearable to the public. The lonely estate, the celebrated father, the infant child, the mysterious intruder who had approached under cover of darkness. It had all the elements of myth. Except that myths are usually told at a safe distance. This was happening in real time. Newspapers fed on each development with a kind of breathless hunger, and a nation already worn raw by hardship found itself gathered around the same story, staring into the same darkness, hoping for a safe return and fearing something much worse. But before the investigation could harden into procedure, before experts would debate handwriting, before names would emerge and suspicions shift and entire lives become entangled in one of the most notorious criminal cases in American history, there was first the emotional center of the crime itself. A child had vanished. A home had been violated. And for all the celebrity surrounding the family, for all the public fascination with aviators and wealth and modern fame, the raw truth beneath it was heartbreakingly simple. A mother and father were thrown into a nightmare from which they would never fully wake. It is tempting, with a case this famous, to begin from the point of legend, to start with the headlines, with the title history eventually gave it, with the way the words Lindbergh kidnapping came to stand for an entire era of crime in America. But titles have a way of flattening human suffering. They reduce lived terror to a label. They make something singular sound inevitable. The truth is that no family ever imagines they are about to become a case. No parent looks at a sleeping child and sees future evidence files, public hearings, disputed testimony, or laws that will later be named in the long shadow of their loss. Those things come afterward, after grief has already entered the house and rearranged the meaning of everything inside it. On that night, the Lindberghs were not yet symbols of a national tragedy. They were a young family in retreat from the glare of public life, trying to build a private world in a place they believed was removed from intrusion. The house itself seemed designed for refuge, set on more than 300 acres of wooded land. It stood apart from neighbors and roads, quiet enough that wind and weather could seem louder than human movement. Privacy was the point. After years of intense public scrutiny, Charles and Ann Lindbergh had chosen this isolated New Jersey home as a kind of shield out there. Among the trees and rolling ground, they could try to live as a family rather than as a spectacle. But isolation is a double-edged thing. What feels like protection by day can feel like exposure at night. Distance can keep away admirers just as easily as it keeps away help, and when something goes wrong in a lonely place, the silence around it can seem almost complicit. That is part of what makes the opening of this story so haunting. Nothing about it is loud at first. There is no dramatic confrontation, no gunshot splitting the dark, no witness in the road raising an alarm. Instead, there is weather, mud, a shuttered nursery, adults moving through the house under the assumption that the most vulnerable person inside it is safe. The dread comes not from spectacle, but from the gradual realization that someone had studied this place, understood its rhythms, and chosen the exact moment when domestic calm was most fragile. Whoever came to that house did not stumble there by chance. Whoever approached that nursery did not arrive in confusion. There was intention in every step. And that intention had crossed from fantasy into action long before anyone inside the home understood the danger. That is what gives the case its enduring power over the imagination. It is not simply the fame of the victims or the historical importance of what followed. It is the intimate violation at its core. A child taken from bed is a crime that bypasses abstraction. It enters straight through the instincts people are born with. The urge to protect, the revulsion at helplessness, the disbelief that an adult mind could conceive of such a thing and then calmly carry it out. The psychology of crimes like this is especially chilling because they do not depend only on greed or rage. They depend on a willingness to look at innocence and see opportunity. They require emotional distance so complete that another family's love becomes, in the criminal imagination, merely a lever to be pulled for money, control, or recognition. The abductor in this case was not just stealing a child. He was exploiting the one truth guaranteed to break any parent open. The knowledge that their child's safety rests in hands they cannot see, and when that child belongs to the most famous household in America, the offense expands outward. It becomes not only an attack on a family, but an attack on the public fantasy that prestige can insulate people from the darkest impulses of others. The Lindbergh name had once represented triumph over distance, mastery over fear. A man alone in the sky conquering what seemed impossible. There was bitter irony in the fact that the crime which would define the next chapter of that name had nothing to do with skies or machines or heroic endurance. It took place at ground level, in mud and darkness. In the shadow beneath a nursery window, one kind of American myth had been built on flight. Another, much darker one, would be built on a ladder leaning against a house while an infant slept inside. And as this story unfolds, it is important to hold on to that contrast, because it reveals something essential about the public obsession that followed. America did not merely witness the Lindbergh kidnapping. It experienced it as a descent from romance into dread. The man who had crossed an ocean alone could not protect his own child in his own home. The family that seemed wrapped in national affection could still be reached by cruelty. The country that had celebrated technological progress and modern celebrity was forced to confront how primitive evil could remain. In every era, certain crimes seize more than headlines. They seize imagination because they strike at a collective vulnerability people rarely admit aloud. This was one of those crimes. It made parents look twice at locked windows. It made isolated houses seem less peaceful. It made the night itself feel populated with thoughts that decent people would rather believe do not exist, and perhaps most haunting of all, it began with a child too young even to understand fear in the way adults do. Charles Lindbergh Jr. was not old enough to know he had become the center of a national crisis. He did not know the power of his surname, the reach of newspapers, the machinery of law that would soon grind into motion around his absence. He was simply a baby, loved and watched over, living inside the private routines of a household that had every reason to believe it could keep him safe. That is why the opening of this story must remain close to him. Close to the fragile human truth beneath the history, before the debates and accusations before the manhunts and ransom demands, before one case would alter the way America thought about kidnapping and federal power. There was a nursery, a crib, a blanket, a night of bad weather, and a child who should have been there. The horror lives in that should. It hovers over the whole case like a second atmosphere. He should have been asleep. The window should have been secure. The house should have held. The darkness outside should have remained outside, but it did not. Something crossed over that boundary. Something entered the story that had no right to be there. And once it did, nothing the Lindberghs had been before would remain intact. What follows is not only the chronicle of a famous crime, but the unraveling of a family's sense of safety, the transformation of a national hero into a father searching through nightmare, and the birth of a case so enormous it would alter American law and public memory. Yet all of that begins here. In the stillness before the alarm fully sounds, in the cold March night when the world had not yet learned what had happened on that hill in New Jersey. A house stands in darkness. A nursery waits above the ground. A child is gone, and the silence before the nation knows it is the last quiet moment this story will ever have. No exact word count was specified in your message, so I'm providing part 2 as a long continuous section in the format you requested. Before the crime became a national obsession, before strangers argued over handwriting and reporters crowded around every rumor, before a child's name was printed in giant letters across front pages, there was a carefully constructed world the Lindberghs had tried to build around themselves. A private refuge assembled in deliberate contrast to fame, to understand why the kidnapping struck the country with such force. It is necessary to step back into that world and see what existed before it was shattered. Charles Augustus Lindbergh was not simply well known in America. By the early 1930s, he occupied a place in the public imagination that was difficult to compare to any ordinary celebrity. He was young, disciplined, handsome in a severe and almost old-fashioned way, and attached to an achievement so dazzling that it seemed to lift him outside the category of ordinary men. In 1927, when he completed the first solo nonstop transatlantic flight from New York to Paris, he became something larger than an aviator. He became proof, at least in the eyes of millions, that courage and modern engineering together could overcome distance, danger, and doubt. Newspapers made him heroic with the speed and hunger only a mass media age could produce. Crowds adored him. Politicians welcomed him. Foreign cities celebrated him. The image hardened quickly. The quiet, modest airman with iron nerves and almost superhuman self-control. Yet fame of that size carries its own violence. It strips away privacy long before it strips away peace. The Lindbergh name became so widely consumed that the man beneath it began to disappear inside his own legend. Charles was admired not only for what he had done, but for how little he seemed to need from others while doing it. He was not flamboyant. He did not perform warmth for the public. He kept parts of himself withheld. And that reserve only intensified the fascination. To admirers, he appeared noble. To critics, cold. To the press, irresistible. Everywhere he went, attention followed. Every movement, every opinion, every silence acquired meaning because the country had invested him with symbolic value. He was an American ideal onto which people projected whatever they most wanted to believe about grit, destiny, modernity, and masculine strength. That sort of attention can become suffocating, and over time, Charles developed a deep mistrust of publicity and intrusion. He had seen what admiration looked like up close. He had also seen how quickly public interest could become entitlement. How easily strangers began to treat a famous life as common property. Annie Amaro Lindbergh entered that orbit from a very different background. Though hers too was marked by prominence and expectation, she was the daughter of Dwight Morrow. a wealthy financier and diplomat who would later serve as ambassador to Mexico and then as a United States Senator from New Jersey. Anne grew up in a household shaped by privilege, intellect, and public visibility. But she brought into the marriage a temperament that contrasted with Charles's hard reserve. She was introspective, sensitive, and highly observant. A gifted writer who noticed emotional nuances others often stepped past. If Charles presented the face of stoic control, Anne's inner world was alive with reflection, doubt, feeling, and the effort to understand both herself and the people around her. Their marriage in 1929 was, from the outside, almost mythic in the way the American public likes its unions among the famous to be mythic. The conquering aviator and the ambassador's daughter. Adventure and refinement, flight and poetry. Together they became one of the most watched couples in the world. But public admiration can disguise the private burden of being turned into symbols. The Lindberghs did not simply live in the spotlight. They lived under constant observation. Pursued by cameras, reporters, well-wishers, curiosity seekers, and sometimes by people whose fascination had crossed into obsession. The same fame that created wealth and opportunity also made domestic life almost impossible. Every trip could become a spectacle. Every appearance could summon a crowd. Even joy became vulnerable to theft once it was visible enough to attract strangers. In that context, the birth of their first child in June 1930 should have been one of the most intimate and consoling milestones in their lives. Charles Augustus Lindbergh, Jr. arrived not merely as a son, but as the living center of a household that had spent years negotiating the distortions of fame. He was, in every practical and emotional sense, the beginning of a new chapter. For Charles, the baby offered a form of meaning untouched by public ceremony. For Anne, he deepened the emotional life she recorded with such honesty in her private writing. To the public, however, the child was immediately something else as well. He was the son of the Lindbergh legend, the baby of America's most famous family. He attracted interest not because of anything he had done, but because of the symbolism attached to his birth. That is one of the silent cruelties at the center of this story. Before he was ever old enough to speak for himself, Charles Jr. had already become a public object of fascination, and because the Lindberghs knew exactly what such fascination could become, they sought distance from it. Their need for privacy was not an eccentric preference. It was a defensive strategy. The family home in Hopewell, New Jersey, often called the Lindbergh estate, reflected that need with almost painful clarity. Built in a secluded area of East Amwell, surrounded by wooded acreage and removed from dense population, it was chosen specifically because it offered retreat. The house sat high enough and far enough from ordinary traffic that it seemed to promise separation from the world that had claimed so much of their lives already. It was not a fortress in the military sense, but it was a deliberate withdrawal from public proximity. Privacy there was architectural, geographic, and psychological. The land around the house acted like a moat of silence. A visitor had to intend to come. A stranger would not simply drift by. It is easy in retrospect, knowing what would happen, to see vulnerability in that isolation. But for the Lindberghs, isolation had another meaning first. It meant relief. It meant mornings unbroken by photographers. It meant evenings when family life could unfold without becoming tomorrow's entertainment. It meant the possibility that a child might grow up with trees instead of flashbulbs at the window. The house was still new in 1932, not yet entirely complete in every practical sense, but already deeply symbolic of the life Charles and Anne were trying to secure. The estate represented a dream common to many people under public scrutiny. That enough distance can restore normalcy, yet distance can also create blind spots. In a city, danger is noisy, visible, immediate, and sometimes interrupted by neighbors or patrols. In the country, danger can approach under cover of quiet. The very seclusion that comforted the Lindberghs also reduced the number of accidental witnesses, slowed spontaneous help, and created long, dark spaces between one point of human attention and the next. That does not mean the house was recklessly chosen. It means only that privacy is never free. It always asks payment somewhere else. By early 1932, the Lindbergh household had its own internal rhythms, the daily structure by which even celebrated lives become ordinary from the inside. Servants and staff helped maintain operations, but the emotional center remained the family itself. Charles was known for discipline, order, and high expectations, not just of others but of himself. Anne moved through motherhood with devotion and sensitivity, though she also bore the strain of public life. Marriage to a difficult and exacting man, and the pressures of raising a child in circumstances that were anything but normal. Charles Jr. was still a toddler, still new enough to the world that security meant routine, familiar faces, and the physical nearness of people he trusted. There is something almost unbearably fragile about that stage of life. A very young child does not understand status, politics, danger, or motive. He lives by rhythm, meal, bath, blanket, crib, the sound of voices nearby. The entire world is as large or as small as the adults who carry him. That vulnerability is what makes the background of this case so important. This was not merely a high-profile household. It was also a nursery at the center of that household. A space built around dependence and care, and therefore a space whose violation would feel to the public like an attack on the most defenseless form of innocence imaginable. The broader social setting matters too. America in 1932 was deep in the Great Depression. The economic collapse of the previous years had eroded faith in institutions, sharpened class resentments, and left millions frightened about survival. Criminal headlines in such a climate carried special force. The public was already primed to think in terms of desperation, instability, and threat at the same time. Mass media had become powerful enough to transform isolated events into national dramas almost instantly. Radio and newspapers could carry fear with extraordinary speed. A crime involving an ordinary child in an ordinary family would have been tragic enough. A crime involving Charles Lindbergh's child was explosive because it touched several national nerves at once. Celebrity, innocence. Wealth, class anxiety. Vulnerability, and the growing suspicion that no one, however admired, was beyond the reach of danger. In another age, the kidnapping might have remained a terrible but more localized event. In 1932, it became a story large enough to absorb the whole country. Charles's public image intensified that effect. He was a hero from a modern age, but one who also seemed to embody older virtues of self-command and moral firmness. People wanted to believe that a man like that lived in a sphere ordered by merit and protected by honor. His survival over the Atlantic had seemed like a triumph of will. That image now stood in painful contrast to the domestic vulnerability of fatherhood. He could navigate weather and darkness alone over an ocean, yet he could not command what approached his own child's window in the New Jersey night. That contrast would become part of the emotional architecture of the case, even before anyone said it aloud. Americans felt the kidnapping not only as a crime, but as a blow to a national fantasy. The invulnerable household had been shown to be vulnerable after all. Anne's position in that background deserves equal attention. Public memory sometimes flattens famous cases around the most visible man in the room. But Anne Morrow Lindbergh was not a decorative figure standing just outside the action. She was a mother, a witness to the emotional collapse of domestic safety, and someone whose sensitivity to atmosphere, fear, and change would have made every disturbance feel amplified. She had already endured the pressures that come with marriage into a legend. She had learned to live in relation to a husband who was admired almost beyond reason. She had also tried to build her own identity as a writer and aviator. Motherhood, for her, carried the possibility of an anchor. The child's presence transformed not only family structure but emotional gravity. It gave the house its most tender center. When considering the background of the case, it matters that this was not a detached aristocratic arrangement in which children were purely ceremonial extensions of lineage. Whatever tensions existed within the marriage, Charles Jr. was cherished. The rhythms of his care organized daily life. His absence would therefore not be an abstract scandal. It would be a physical ripping away of the household's center. The estate itself, often romanticized in hindsight, was also unfinished in ways that add texture to the story. New homes, however beautiful, are often transitional spaces. Rooms are still being adjusted. Habits are still forming. Certain practical arrangements may not yet be as instinctive or as secure as they become later. That detail matters psychologically because criminals often exploit what families themselves have not yet fully settled. The Lindbergh home was not chaotic, but it was still new enough that the sense of settled permanence may have exceeded the actual tested security of the place. And because the family had retreated there for privacy rather than for defensive strategy, their mental map of the house was shaped more by the desire to live than by the expectation of attack. That difference between perceived safety and actual vulnerability is often where notorious crimes begin. Nothing is careless in the obvious sense. Yet danger enters through the gap between what people believe their environment means and what it can actually permit. There had already been warning signs, in a broad sense, that the Lindbergh name attracted unstable attention. The family's fame invited letters, intrusions, and public curiosity. Charles himself understood that too well. He disliked publicity not merely because it was tiresome, but because it transformed private realities into public property. Being watched changes how a person imagines risk. It also changes what kinds of risk exist. A famous child is not protected by recognition. In some minds, recognition is precisely what makes the child valuable. That is one of the ugliest truths underlying this background. The same national affection that made people feel close to the Lindbergh family also made the family more legible to anyone driven by greed, resentment, or pathological fantasy. Their names were famous. Their faces were known. Their resources were presumed substantial. Their movements attracted notice. To most Americans, those facts formed the ingredients of glamour. To the wrong mind, they formed the ingredients of opportunity, and it is within that collision between domestic tenderness and public overexposure that the Lindbergh kidnapping becomes more than a sensational crime. It becomes the story of how fame rearranges danger in an ordinary household. Parents fear illness, accidents, maybe anonymous local threats. In a household like this, there is also the shadow cast by notoriety. The knowledge that strangers know your child exists and may feel some warped sense of relationship to your life. The Lindberghs tried to solve that problem the way many people under public pressure try to solve it. They withdrew. They chose woods and distance. They trusted in retreat. What they could not control was the fact that retreat does not erase visibility once a family has already been made symbolic in the national imagination. By the time March 1932 arrived, the Lindberghs were living at the intersection of several forces they could not fully master. There was Charles's fame, vast and distorting. There was Anne's sensitivity and longing for inward life. There was the child, beloved and publicly fascinating. There was the New Jersey estate, beautiful and remote. There was the Depression-era mood of insecurity hanging over the nation. And there was the press, always ready to transform private anguish into mass consumption. These forces did not cause the crime. Of course, responsibility belongs to the person who chose to abduct a child. but they shaped the meaning of the crime before it even happened. They determined why the kidnapping, once discovered, would become immediate national theater rather than a tragedy grieved in relative quiet. The abduction did not merely strike a family. It struck a symbol the country had built and then assumed would remain intact. That is why the background cannot be reduced to dates and biographical facts. It must be understood as atmosphere. A hero grown weary of being public. A thoughtful young mother trying to raise a child in the half-light between privilege and intrusion. A toddler asleep in a house built as a sanctuary. A nation hungry for heroes and eager to possess them. A remote home standing still under late winter skies. The image is serene until one looks closely enough to see what serenity is made of. Hope, fatigue. Design, routine. And the fragile assumption that the walls of a private life still mean something in a world of relentless attention. Soon that assumption would be broken. But in part 2, before the nursery is discovered empty, before ransom and suspicion and grief begin to dominate every room, it is important to remain here for a moment. In the world as the Lindberghs wanted it to be, a place where their child could sleep far from crowds. A place where marriage and parenthood might be allowed to unfold without performance. A place where one of the most famous men alive could stop being a symbol long enough to be simply a father walking the grounds of his own home. That was the dream. The tragedy of this case is not only that a child was taken, but that the act exposed how thin the boundary was between that dream and the darkness beyond it. No exact word count was specified in your message. So I'm providing part 3 as a long continuous section in the exact format you requested, before the kidnapping became a public obsession. Before the child's face turned into a newspaper image and his name became a symbol of loss, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was simply a little boy at the center of a young family's private world. That fact can become strangely difficult to hold onto in a case this famous. History has a habit of flattening children in notorious crimes until they seem to exist only in relation to what was done to them. Their names survive. Their photographs survive. Their ages survive. But the living texture of who they were begins to fade beneath the weight of public memory. The victim becomes an emblem. The child becomes a headline. The tragedy becomes larger than the person who first bore it. But Charles Jr. was not born into history. He was born into a household. He belonged first not to the country, not to law, not to legend, but to the intimate routines of his parents' care. He was a son before he was a case. He was loved before he was mourned. He was held, fed, bathed, watched over, soothed to sleep, carried from room to room, and woven into the countless small repetitions through which a family begins to understand itself. The true cruelty of the crime is impossible to grasp unless that living child is restored to the center of the story. He was born on June 22nd, 1930, to parents whose names were already weighted with public meaning. But infancy has no awareness of symbolism. A baby does not know that cameras flash because of his father. He does not know that strangers recognize his surname. He does not know that the world outside his nursery has expectations for what his family represents. His world, in the beginning, is far smaller and far more immediate. It is warmth, hunger, voice, touch, light shifting across a room, the smell of cloth and milk and wood polish, the soft and familiar certainty of adults leaning over him. In that sense, Charles Jr. lived where all very young children live, inside the physical nearness of care. And perhaps that is why this case still unsettles the imagination so deeply. The crime violated not only a household, but the fragile architecture of early childhood itself. The protected little kingdom in which the world is supposed to arrive filtered through loving hands. Accounts of Charles Jr. from the period inevitably carry the tenderness adults reserve for very young children. He was small, fair, and, in the eyes of those around him, precious in a way that felt almost doubled by the unusual life into which he had been born. Yet what made him precious to his parents was not the public interest attached to him. It was his ordinary, intimate reality. He was the child who turned the Lindbergh home into a family home. The nursery was not just another room. It was a center of emotional gravity. His sleep shaped the rhythms of the evening. His moods shaped the atmosphere of the day. The people caring for him would have known the particular signs that only caregivers learn to read with precision, the meaning of one cry as opposed to another. The little changes in expression that suggested fatigue or curiosity or discomfort, the way he responded to certain voices. The gestures that signaled recognition before language had fully formed. It is easy to overlook how rich a child's presence is when the child is too young to leave behind his own written words. But anyone who has lived around a toddler knows how entire households begin to orbit them. Chairs become obstacles to be noticed. Staircases become threats to be guarded. Mealtimes, naps, baths, fresh clothes, nighttime rituals. All of it bends around the child's needs. The home was not merely sheltering Charles Jr. It was being shaped by him. He was, in that very literal domestic sense, changing the contours of everyday life. There is something especially poignant about the fact that he was the first child. First children often transform their parents in ways later histories do not fully capture. Their arrival creates new identities at the same time it creates a new life. Charles Lindbergh, who had once been seen by the world as the lone man over the Atlantic, became in private a father learning the rhythms of dependency. Anna Morrow Lindbergh, already thoughtful and observant, entered a deeper register of emotional investment and vulnerability as a mother, whatever their differences of temperament. Whatever strains already existed in a marriage lived under extraordinary pressure. The child gave them a shared center. That is part of what makes the victim's story inseparable from the family story. He was not only loved individually. He functioned as a bridge, a living point of convergence between two adults navigating fame, expectation, and the difficult effort to preserve inward life against outward demand. His existence softened some edges and sharpened others. Children do that. They deepen joy and deepen fear simultaneously. They make life more concrete and more fragile at once. Charles Jr. His daily world was shaped by domestic predictability. Though the Lindberghs lived under unusual public conditions, the core experiences of early childhood remained recognizably universal. He would have known familiar rooms before he knew the geography of anything larger. He would have recognized caregivers by voice and movement. He would have lived by sequences rather than by clock time, as adults understand it. Morning light entering the room. Hands lifting him from bed, clothing changed. Breakfast prepared, some moments of play. Moments of fussiness, moments of drowsiness. Being carried again, being put down again. The sound of doors opening and closing, conversation drifting in from elsewhere in the house. Perhaps laughter, perhaps the muted stress of adults trying not to let their tension reach him. A toddler's memory is not historical, but sensory. The world settles into the body before it settles into narrative. That is what was stolen from him when he was taken. Not a future he could yet imagine, but the continuity of trust that every child deserves without having to earn it. The public, of course, saw him differently, even before the crime. There was fascination in the fact that this child was the son of Charles Lindbergh, in another family. A toddler is mostly known to relatives, neighbors, and friends. Charles Jr. had, by accident of birth, become visible to strangers, yet visibility is not the same thing as personhood. The gap between those two things is where so much of the tragedy resides. The country knew of him. his parents knew him. Those are not remotely the same. The country saw an heir to a legend, the child of a famous aviator and a prominent young mother. His parents saw a little boy whose existence had nothing to prove and nothing to symbolize inside the walls of the home. He was not a public extension of achievement there. He was a baby being raised. One of the darkest aspects of crimes against children is the way they collapse this distinction. They take the child as the criminal imagines him, not as the family lives him. In this case, the abductor did not approach the nursery in response to Charles Jr. His personality, laughter, emerging habits, or vulnerability. He approached because of what the child represented in the adult world beyond the nursery, to the criminal mind. He was leverage. He was value. He was a means toward money or notoriety or control. That cold reduction of a child's humanity is, in some ways, the psychological center of the case. It is why telling the victim's story matters so much. The only real rebuttal to that reduction is to insist on his personhood. However brief his life, there are children who live long enough to tell us who they became. There are others, like Charles Jr., whose stories must be assembled from the care they inspired, the routines they inhabited, the hopes projected onto them, and the rupture left behind when they were taken. His victimhood cannot be the first thing said about him. It must be the last thing history was able to do with his name. Not the first truth of his existence. In the Lindbergh house, Charles Jr. represented not celebrity but domestic hope. He was the future in its most intimate form. He brought with him the possibility that his parents' lives, so battered by scrutiny, might still become anchored in something private and sustaining. That does not mean the household was idyllic in every hidden way. No household is. But children often create new emotional weather inside adult lives, and this seems to have been true here as well. Anne's sensibility, in particular, was responsive to the emotional detail of family life. Her writing suggests a mind attentive to fragility, atmosphere, and the subtle registers of human attachment. A child in such a household would not have been a decorative accessory to status. He would have been felt deeply and daily as presence. Charles, for all his reserve and severity, was also not untouched by fatherhood. Men who appear hardest to the outside world are often least understood in the private forms of care they do not advertise. Whatever was hidden from public view, the child was undeniably central enough that his disappearance would later rip through Charles with the helplessness the public was not used to associating with him. That helplessness only makes sense if the emotional bond was real and powerful. The victim's story is therefore also the story of how thoroughly a life can matter even before it has had time to unfold. Charles Jr. did not need years to become meaningful. He was meaningful because he was known in love, a child that age leaves traces everywhere without leaving records. In the nursery, in the arrangement of clothing, in toys set aside, in blankets folded for use, in the routines of servants and parents, in conversations about health, sleep, feeding, travel, weather, and comfort. He existed in the ordinary clutter of dependence. That sort of existence is often invisible to outsiders because it lacks dramatic markers, but it is exactly what later grief measures itself against. After a child is taken, the house does not only feel empty in one room. It feels emptied of sequence. The next feeding does not happen. The next bath does not happen. The next sleepy protest. The next small smile. The next lift into waiting arms. All of these expected moments vanish, and with them vanishes a whole anticipated future of similar moments. One reason the Lindbergh kidnapping resonated so widely is that parents everywhere could imagine those missing continuities with horrible clarity. They did not need to know the Lindberghs personally to understand what it means for a nursery to become a room full of interrupted intention. Even people without children can feel the moral obscenity of targeting a child too young to defend himself, too young to grasp betrayal. But parents feel another layer as well, the physiological recoil from the idea that a sleeping child can be reached by an outside will. Charles Jr. became, in that terrible way, more than himself to the nation because he stood at the center of one of humanity's most instinctive fears. Yet if we stay close to his actual life, another truth emerges. He was also ordinary in the way all children are ordinary, and that ordinariness is beautiful. He would have been subject to all the tiny unpredictabilities that make toddlers feel alive in a house. There would have been moments of crankiness, curiosity, resistance, delight, perhaps days when he slept poorly, perhaps days when he became fascinated by some trivial object adults barely noticed. Children at that age often create meaning out of repetition and surprise at once. A spoon dropped from a high chair becomes endlessly interesting. A shadow on the wall becomes a source of quiet attention. A familiar face re-entering a room becomes an event. These are the scales on which early life is lived. When later generations remember him only in sepia photographs, it can be difficult to imagine that he once inhabited those living, changing little moods, but he did. He was not born solemn because history later became solemn around him. He was a child in motion. That is why even the stillness of the nursery before the kidnapping feels deceptive. Children are still only when sleeping. The rest of the time, they animate the house in ways adults do not always notice until silence replaces them. It is also important to remember that Charles Jr., as life unfolded inside a family that was trying, however imperfectly, to shield him from public consumption, the move toward privacy in New Jersey was part of that effort. His parents' desire for seclusion was not just self-protective, it was parental. They were not merely escaping crowds for their own comfort. They were trying to create a space where their child could exist first as a child rather than as a public curiosity. That ambition gives his story an added tenderness. He was meant to grow in distance from the machinery of attention. The house on the hill, the woods, the quiet rooms, the rhythms away from cities and cameras. All of that was supposed to widen the space between his real life and his public image. Instead, the crime collapsed that distance completely. In one night, he became more exposed in absence than he had ever been in life. The country learned details about his room, his clothing, his routines, the layout of the house, the habits of the family. All because the effort to protect him had been broken open. There is a particularly cruel irony in that the very child his parents tried to raise in privacy became one of the most publicly discussed children in American history because that privacy had been violated. When considering victimhood in true crime, respect requires restraint from invention. It would be dishonest to pretend we know every expression on Charles Jr. His face or every sound he made in the nursery, but respect also requires refusing to let the victim disappear into paperwork. Enough is known to say this with confidence. He was deeply wanted, deeply significant to his parents, and living at the most defenseless stage of life when care is not optional but absolute. A child of 20 months lives inside trust. He does not decide it. He breathes it. He assumes that the people who lift him, feed him, and put him to sleep are the whole architecture of safety. He does not know that there are adults elsewhere in the world capable of seeing his dependence as exploitable. That innocence is not sentimental, it is biological, developmental, and sacred in the plainest human sense. The violation of it is what elevates this crime from sensational to unbearable. The victim's story, then, is in one sense painfully short. A child born into a famous family is loved, sheltered, and carried into the private routines of home. He is not given the time to become the boy he might have been. much less the man, yet in another sense. His story is immense because the force of his loss radiated outward through family, law, media, and national imagination. Entire institutions moved in the aftermath of what happened to him. Public fear changed, federal attention changed. The language of kidnapping in America changed. That afterlife of consequence can make it seem as if the victim's significance lies in what his death caused. But that would be backward. The changes mattered because he mattered first. Law moved because a child had been stolen. The nation cared because a child's life, however brief, had value that no ransom demand and no courtroom proceeding could measure. It is worth pausing over the smallest, most ordinary image: a toddler asleep in bed, unaware of the machinery of adulthood around him. Nothing about that image is grand. Nothing about it asks for history. And yet history entered that room anyway. That is what gives the victim's story its haunting force. Charles Jr. was living inside the simplest human condition: dependence on those who loved him, when the ambitions, greed, and calculations of an adult intruded. He did not choose visibility. He did not choose danger. He did not choose to become part of a national trauma. He was chosen by someone else for reasons that had nothing to do with who he was and everything to do with what criminal thinking does to innocence. It takes a child and sees a bargaining chip. It takes a home and sees access. It takes love and sees leverage against that ugliness. The victim's story offers the only morally necessary correction. Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was not leverage. He was not a symbol before others made him one. He was not a headline waiting to happen. He was a little boy at the center of a household that had arranged itself around his care. He belonged to a mother who would never stop feeling the shape of his absence, and to a father whose fame could not shield him from the oldest helplessness known to any parent. He belonged to a world of blankets, windows, footsteps in hallways, familiar voices at bedtime, and arms that should have been enough to keep him safe. That they were not enough is the beginning of the tragedy. That he existed fully before the tragedy is the truth that must not be lost. No exact word count was specified in your message, so I'm providing part 4 as a long continuous section in the format you requested. The night of March 1st, 1932, did not begin like the opening of a national tragedy. It began the way many terrible nights begin. Beneath the appearance of routine, the Lindbergh family was at their home near Hopewell, New Jersey, a house built for quiet and distance. The kind of place where darkness settled fully and the outside world seemed to withdraw early. It was cold. Rain had fallen off and on, and the dampness clung to the grounds, softening the earth around the house and turning the surrounding property into a patchwork of mud, wet leaves, and darkness. The trees stood black against the evening sky. Wind moved through them in low, restless passes, not violent enough to alarm anyone on its own, but enough to create the kind of weather that unsettles a house from the outside inward. Shutters tremble, branches scrape. The night seems occupied even when no one is there, inside. The household followed its usual pattern. There had been concerns earlier about the baby's health. Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. had been unwell with a slight cold. And because of that, he had not been taken back to the family's other residence as originally planned. Instead, he remained at the New Jersey house, tucked into the nursery that should have been the safest room in the building. It is one of the details that deepens the ache of the story. Small parental decisions, made out of care and caution, often become loaded with unbearable meaning after disaster. A child is kept home because he is under the weather. He is put to bed in familiar surroundings. Adults do what loving adults do every day, adjusting plans in response to a little cough, a little fever, a little fragility. In ordinary life, these are signs of care. In hindsight, they become the last normal acts before a nightmare. The nursery itself was on the second floor. A room set apart enough to be quiet, reached by the rhythms of those attending to the child, and then left to the silence of sleep. At some point during the evening, Charles Jr. was placed in his crib by his nurse, Betty Gow. The woman entrusted with much of his day-to-day care. She would later become one of the most important witnesses in reconstructing the night. Not because she saw the abductor, but because she had known exactly how the room was left when the child went to sleep. There is something grimly intimate about crimes of disappearance. Their violence often becomes visible first not through noise, but through discrepancy. A blanket in the wrong position, a window where it should not be open, a room that holds the shape of care but no longer contains the child for whom that care was intended. Earlier in the evening, nothing in the house announced catastrophe. Charles Lindbergh and Anne Morrow Lindbergh were moving through the routines of private family life. Staff carried out their duties, doors were opened and closed. Lamps were turned on against the dark. Meals and domestic conversation occupied the spaces that, in every household, create the illusion that if all is proceeding as usual indoors, then the outdoors can be trusted to remain outside, but somewhere beyond that circle of lamplight. Someone had already committed himself to an act that required patience, nerve, and a chilling degree of planning. He had come to the estate equipped. He had not wandered there by accident. He had chosen the night, chosen the house, chosen the child, and chosen a method. That is what gives the incident its particular coldness. It was not impulsive. It was not the sudden combustion of emotion. It was a deliberate crossing into the private life of others, carried out under cover of darkness with the intention of removing a human being from the center of his family. The latter is one of the most haunting objects in the case because it turns abstract evil into something handmade and practical. Whoever came to the house came with a ladder long enough to reach the second-floor nursery window. That detail strips away any romantic fog that sometimes gathers around famous crimes. There was wood against brick. There was weight on rungs. There was a body climbing in the dark toward a sleeping child. Even before the room was discovered empty, the incident had already taken on a terrifying physical reality. The abductor was not a phantom. He was a man exerting himself against weather and height, testing balance, carrying intention upward toward the window. At some point, sometime after the child had been put down for the evening and before his absence was discovered, the intruder reached the nursery. The precise sequence inside that room cannot be known with perfect certainty. And that uncertainty is part of what has made the kidnapping so enduringly disturbing. Silence hides the most frightening things. There were no witnesses to narrate the exact motions. No adult stood in the nursery and saw a face bending over the crib. What can be imagined, responsibly and with restraint, is enough. A sleeping toddler. A window approached from outside. A figure entering or reaching in. The unfamiliar touch of hands that did not belong in that room. Perhaps the child stirred. Perhaps he did not fully wake. Perhaps there was confusion too brief and too small to become any kind of alarm that others in the house could hear. The horror of crimes against very young children often lies in how little force is required to overpower them. They do not understand the situation. They cannot interpret motive. They cannot summon the kind of resistance an older child might. Their entire safety depends on adults honoring boundaries. When an adult instead exploits that trustless helplessness, the act acquires a special kind of moral ugliness. The room, later examined for clues, suggested disturbance. A ransom note would be found. The child would be gone. And outside, beneath the nursery window, the ground would tell its own rough version of the story in impressions. Damage, and fragments left behind by haste or strain. But those revelations belong to the next stage. In the incident itself, the essential fact is brutally simple. Someone entered the perimeter of the Lindbergh home on a wet March night, climbed to the nursery, and removed the sleeping 20-month-old son of Charles and Ann Lindbergh from his crib. That single act transformed every ordinary object in the house. The crib became evidence. The window became an entry point. The grounds became a scene of pursuit and speculation. The house, built as a refuge, became the location of violation. The timing of the discovery intensified the shock. It was around 10 p. when Betty Gow went to check on the child and found the crib empty. That moment is worth dwelling on, because discovery in crimes like this does not arrive all at once. It fractures reality in stages. A caretaker enters a room expecting one thing and sees another. At first, the mind resists what the eyes report. Perhaps the baby has been moved. Perhaps someone took him downstairs. Perhaps there has been some miscommunication among the adults. For a few seconds, denial serves as a mercy, not because it changes the truth, but because the truth is too large to enter all at once. Then the missing body of the child begins to dominate the room. The crib is too empty. The blankets are wrong. The air itself feels wrong. The mind begins running through explanations faster than language can hold them. Where is he? Who moved him? Did anyone say anything? Has there been some mistake? And then the most terrible question of all arrives, not fully formed but already poisonous. If no one in the house has him, then who does? Betty Gow raised the alarm immediately. Her cry brought Charles Lindbergh running. In the minutes that followed, one can imagine the house changing character almost instantly. Domestic sounds would have become urgent ones. Footsteps sharpened. Doors opened faster. Voices rose. The calm architecture of family life was suddenly repurposed toward search, verification, disbelief. Charles went to the nursery and confronted what no parent should ever have to confront. A child absent from the place where the child had last been protected. He saw the empty crib. He saw the open window. He saw the note. 2. Was drawn into the unfolding horror. There are moments in human life when language becomes both excessive and insufficient. The discovery of a missing child is one of them. People speak because they must act, must ask, must call, must verify. And yet every word seems too small for what is happening. It is likely that the first moments after discovery were full of half-formed questions, commands, incredulous repetitions, names said aloud as if speaking them could somehow reverse what had already been done. Charles Lindbergh reportedly found the ransom note on the windowsill. That detail is almost theatrical in its cruelty, as if the intruder had not merely taken the child, but staged the scene so that the parents would be forced to encounter his intention in writing before they could even complete the emotional fact of the disappearance. The note itself was more than communication. It was domination. It told the family that this absence was no accident, no misunderstanding, no wandering off, no medical emergency. It was an abduction. Someone else had acted on their child. Someone else now claimed the power to dictate what happened next. That transfer of control is central to the psychology of kidnapping. The criminal seeks not only money but leverage over emotion, time, and hope. By leaving the note, the abductor made sure that the first stage of grief and panic would be shaped by his terms, even before the authorities fully entered the scene. The family was being drawn into a script he had written. Search began at once. First within the house and then just beyond it. That instinct is primal. People search even when logic says the search cannot possibly succeed. They open doors. They know they opened a minute earlier. They call names a baby is too young to answer properly. They moved through rooms as if the impossible might suddenly give way to the ordinary. The grounds outside the house, wet and dark, offered little comfort. Night concealed distance and distorted sound. The area around the nursery window, however, quickly suggested the broad outline of what had happened. There was evidence of the ladder. There were marks in the earth. The physicality of the crime became undeniable. Someone had come from outside. This was not a domestic misunderstanding. The child had not somehow left the crib under his own power. He had been taken. In those first minutes, Charles himself is said to have gone outside with a gun. Scanning the darkness, that image has endured because it carries so much of the emotional contradiction at the heart of the case. The national hero, the transatlantic pilot, the man whose legend rested on skill and nerve, is reduced in an instant to the oldest and most helpless role in human history. A father looking into the dark for a stolen child. A gun in the hand offers no real control against a crime already completed. Still, people grasp what they can. Movement feels better than paralysis. Search feels better than waiting. Rage feels better than collapse. Yet beneath all of it is the dawning truth that the child is already beyond immediate reach. That is the moment when the incident becomes more than action. It becomes nightmare. Calls were placed. Local police were notified. The machinery of official response began to turn, but in the opening phase, everything still carried the speed and confusion of crisis. Authorities arriving at the estate would have encountered a scene already saturated with panic. The parents were not merely distressed. They were inside a rupture of reality. Staff members, too, would have been shaken. Their routines instantly transformed into witness statements and recollection. What had been heard? What had been seen? When was the child last checked? Who had been where? What was unusual? The first hours of an investigation into a kidnapping are always critical, but they are also chaotic because human beings do not experience time cleanly under shock. Minutes blur. Sounds are remembered out of order. People become certain of small details and uncertain of large ones, or the reverse. And here the pressure was multiplied by the identity of the family. The victim was not an unknown child in an anonymous home. He was Charles Lindbergh's son. That fact would soon magnify everything. But even before the press descended, everyone present would have understood that this crime was not going to remain private. Still, in those first moments, the public had not yet fully arrived. The incident was still, in its most immediate reality, a family catastrophe. The nursery window, the note, the empty crib, the wet ground below. These were not yet national symbols. They were the specific material facts around which a mother and father were trying to comprehend the disappearance of their baby. The emotional rhythm of those early hours must have been brutal. Panic surges and then stumbles into action. Action collapses into disbelief. Disbelief hardens into dread. Hope survives in irrational forms because the alternative is too monstrous. A ransom note. After all, can at first seem like proof that the child is alive. That is one of the paradoxes of kidnapping. The very instrument of terror also becomes, in the early mind of the family, a possible thread of hope. If there is a note, then maybe there is a plan. If there is a plan, then maybe the child can be recovered. Fear and hope become tangled so tightly they are almost indistinguishable. That emotional entanglement would shape everything that followed. But it began here, in the incident itself. With the first recognition that the child had not simply vanished into mystery, he had been taken by someone who wanted something. The night air outside the house would have felt colder after the discovery, not because the temperature changed, but because meaning had changed. A rural property that earlier suggested peace now suggested exposure. Every tree line might conceal a watcher. Every sound might hint at retreating footsteps long gone. The damp ground below the window no longer belonged to Weather alone. It belonged to the intruder who had used it as a path in and out of the family's life. One of the most unsettling features of the incident is the way it combines intimacy with distance. Close enough to lean into the nursery, close enough to stand for at least a brief moment inside the domestic center of the Lindbergh family. And yet he remained, in identity. Faceless, he was both present and absent at once. That duality would define the case. His act was immediate. His person receded into darkness for the family. That meant the horror had no clear target. There was no known enemy to confront. No visible attacker to hate with precision. Only a vacancy in the crib and a message left behind by an unseen will. In the history of famous crimes, that combination often proves especially powerful. A visible wound can at least be pointed to. An invisible offender leaves terror suspended in speculation. When the first official eyes surveyed the room and grounds, the shape of the crime came into focus rapidly enough to terrify, but not rapidly enough to comfort. It was an abduction, yes. But that label did not answer the questions that mattered most. Who had done this? How long ago? Was the child still nearby? Was he alive and unharmed? Had the note told the truth? Was this a financial crime, a personal vendetta? A deranged act of obsession. The incident ended the moment the child was removed from the house. But in another sense, it kept happening inside those questions. Every unknown lengthened the original act. Every silence from the dark made the crime continue in the minds of the parents. That is the particular torture of kidnapping. The event is not over when the abductor leaves. It echoes in waiting. Bargaining, imagining, fearing. Yet the incident itself must be understood with all its plain, brutal edges. On March 1st, 1932, in a secluded New Jersey home, a man used a ladder to reach a second-floor nursery window, abducted a 20-month-old child from his crib, left behind a ransom note, and disappeared back into the night before the crime was discovered. Nothing in the grandeur of the Lindbergh name softened that fact. If anything, it made the violation feel even more obscene. The house had been built to hold back the world. And the world entered anyway in one of its darkest forms. The child at the center of that room had no way to understand what was happening. His parents had no way to stop what had already been done by the time they understood it. The incident was over before alarm began. And that helpless delay is part of why the case became so haunting. People like to imagine that terror announces itself in time to be resisted. Often it does not. Often it works quietly. Often it depends on the ordinary continuing right up until the moment it no longer can. That was the true violence of the Lindbergh kidnapping's opening act. It stole not only a child, but the family's trust in the ordinary sequence of evening, sleep, and safety. After that night, no routine in that house could ever mean the same thing again. No exact word count was specified in your message, so I'm providing Part 5 as a long continuous section in the format you requested. By the time the first wave of panic settled into official action, the Lindbergh home had already ceased to be merely a home. It had become a crime scene, though in those first hours the transformation was imperfect. Hurried, and charged with the kind of emotional confusion that can alter evidence before anyone fully understands what must be protected. This is often how famous cases begin, not in the clean, sealed-off order that later generations imagine, but in a blur of human urgency. Family members move through rooms in terror. Servants call out and retrace their steps. Police arrive while the emotional temperature is still rising. Well-meaning people touch things they should not touch. Doors are opened. Lights are turned on. Questions are asked before anyone has the luxury of silence. And yet, Even in that unstable beginning, the scene around the nursery offered immediate clues that something calculated had happened there. The room itself held the sharpest contradiction in the entire case. It was still recognizably a nursery. A place defined by routine, tenderness, and the assumptions of safety that surround a sleeping child. The crib stood where it had stood. The familiar arrangements of the room remained, at least in part, in place, and yet the center of the room had been violently altered by one fact. The child was gone. That absence changed the meaning of everything around it. The blanket no longer suggested sleep. The window no longer suggested ventilation or a view. The sill no longer suggested structure. Each object had been recruited into a crime and stripped of its innocence. When investigators and those already inside the home looked closely, they saw signs that the room had been intruded upon from outside. The window was open. There were marks and disturbances that implied entry or contact. On the windowsill sat the ransom note, a detail so brazen it gave the intrusion an almost theatrical cruelty. The kidnapper had not merely removed the child. He had left behind instructions, or rather demands, forcing the family and the authorities to understand immediately that this was an abduction tied to money, leverage, and control. The note did not calm the room. It poisoned it. It declared that whoever had entered this space had done so with purpose, had anticipated the family's horror, and had chosen to direct that horror into a sequence of actions of his own design. In psychological terms, that matters enormously. The note was not only informational, it was the first exercise of dominance after the child's removal. It told everyone present that the offender intended not just to take, but to orchestrate what came next. The crime scene outside the nursery window was equally significant. Perhaps even more so because it translated the abstraction of kidnapping into physical movement through real space. Below the window, the ground was soft from the damp weather. The earth bore impressions, disturbances, and the rough testimony of weight. A homemade ladder had been used, and that ladder itself soon became one of the central pieces of early physical evidence. It was not the polished tool of a professional institution. It was something constructed for a grim purpose. An object whose design and damage invited questions from the first moment it was seen. Ladders are not subtle things. They announce intention. A ladder brought to a secluded estate in darkness says that the person carrying it did not come to explore, or to wander, or to test a fantasy. He came prepared to scale the outer wall of a private house and reach a specific room above ground. That preparation suggests rehearsal, planning, knowledge, or at least determination strong enough to compensate for imperfect knowledge. It also suggests risk tolerance. A man climbing a ladder to a child's nursery on a wet night is exposing himself to noise, instability, weather, and the possibility of discovery. That he did it anyway indicates either great desperation, great confidence, or a mind so fixed on the prize that ordinary caution had been overtaken by criminal focus. The ladder itself showed signs of strain. Parts of it appeared damaged, and the condition of the area beneath the window suggested that something had gone wrong during the entry or exit. This became one of the first and most haunting clues because it hinted at a struggle not necessarily between people, but between plan and reality. Perhaps the ladder slipped. Perhaps it cracked under weight. Perhaps the abductor lost balance while carrying the child. Those possibilities mattered because they introduced immediate uncertainty about what had happened to Charles Jr. After he was taken from the crib in a kidnapping, the first instinct of the family is often to hold on to the belief that the victim is alive and being held for ransom. The presence of a damaged ladder complicated that hope from the outset. It opened the terrifying possibility that the removal itself had gone badly. At the time, no one in the nursery or around the property could know what that damage truly meant. But as an initial clue, it cast a shadow over every hopeful interpretation. The route in and out of the house appeared centered on that nursery window. And this fact gave the investigators an early structure for understanding the offense. The intruder had likely approached the house from the outside grounds, placed or raised the ladder against the wall, climbed to the second-floor window, gained access to the nursery, removed the child, and descended again into the night. That sequence may sound straightforward when laid out in retrospect, but its implications in real time were unnerving. It meant the offender had entered the most intimate and protected room in the house without waking the household in time to stop him. It meant he had navigated darkness and weather with enough discipline to come and go before discovery. It meant he had carried a living child out through an elevated opening and down unstable footing without immediate interception. A house built for privacy had not merely been observed from a distance. It had been penetrated at its most vulnerable point. The note itself quickly became a focus of fascination and suspicion. It was handwritten, with distinctive spelling, syntax, and symbols that suggested either a writer not fully comfortable with English or someone attempting to imitate that lack of comfort. The wording was strange, the errors conspicuous, the tone both crude and commanding. Early readers would have understood at once that the author wanted to seem in control while concealing identity behind awkward language. Whether the note reflected genuine linguistic limitations or deliberate disguise would become a major issue later. But even in the first hours, it was already doing important work as a clue. Handwriting can betray habit, education, nationality, strain, and performance. Spelling can reveal background or manipulation. The note also contained a demand for money, establishing motive on the surface as ransom, though surface motive in criminal cases is never the whole story. What mattered first was that the offender wanted the family to believe the child had been taken for financial gain. That belief, whether true or strategically convenient, would shape the next phase of the case more than any other single factor. The moment a ransom note appears, the emotional and investigative landscape changes. Police are no longer simply looking at a disappearance. They are balancing evidence preservation against the possibility that too much visible force may endanger the victim. Parents are no longer grieving in a single direction. They are compelled to act in accordance with someone else's timetable. Hope remains alive precisely because the criminal appears to want something other than immediate destruction, and that hope can become its own form of torment. At the nursery, the first clues also included smaller signs that carried enormous weight because the case was so fresh and the questions so urgent. The child's clothing and bedding became subjects of scrutiny. The condition of the crib mattered. The arrangement of blankets mattered, whether the child had been asleep, whether he had been wrapped, whether he had been carried out in pajamas or additional covering. These details were not merely technical. They spoke to how much time the abductor had taken, how carefully or hurriedly he had moved, and how the child might have been exposed to the cold March night. The fact that investigators and family members were already imagining the child's condition gave each clue a painful double life. Every observation was both evidence and emotional burden. A missing blanket might suggest the abductor intended to keep the child warm, or it might suggest concealment. A disturbed crib might indicate haste, or it might indicate care. In this way, the crime scene forced everyone into a dreadful interpretive state where the smallest domestic detail acquired life or death significance. Outside, traces on the ground promised leads but also invited confusion. Footprints in rural settings are never as simple as crime fiction pretends. Weather softens edges. Prior household movement can overlap with criminal movement. Police, staff, and family can easily contaminate the area in the rush to search. This is one reason the Lindbergh scene became so frustrating from the beginning. There were clues. Certainly, but clues do not always add up cleanly, especially when a scene is active before it is secured. The hope of immediate reconstruction collided with the messy truth that real environments do not preserve criminal acts like tidy diagrams. Still, the ladder, the window, the ground below, and the note formed a cluster strong enough to establish the broad shape of the event. The intruder had come from outside. He had used equipment. He had reached the nursery directly. He had left by the same route or one closely related, and he had intended communication. These were substantial facts, but they were not enough to answer the question that consumed the family and the authorities alike. Who was he? One of the chilling aspects of the initial clues is how much they suggested planning and how little they immediately yielded in the way of identity. The offender was organized enough to prepare a ladder and ransom note, yet he remained faceless. His traces were material, not personal. That distinction matters because early investigations often succeed when the first clues are not only physical, but relational. A witness recognizes a figure. A household employee notices a suspicious face from earlier days. A vehicle is remembered. A name surfaces from prior conflict. Here, in the opening moments, there was mostly structure without a person attached to it. That is a very dangerous kind of clue pattern because it makes fear expand into possibility if the offender is not immediately locatable within the family's known world. Then he could be anywhere outside it. The crime scene thus created not only a theory of entry, but a widening sphere of dread. Any man with enough nerve and enough resentment or greed might fit the outline. The note, in particular, deepened this unease because it suggested a criminal mind trying to negotiate with invisibility. He did not wish to be seen, but he wanted to be heard. He did not want the family to know him, but he wanted them to obey him. That asymmetry is characteristic of kidnappers, especially those intoxicated by the psychological leverage they possess. The note's odd spelling and symbols also seem to project an identity without actually yielding one, as though the writer were presenting a mask and inviting everyone to mistake it for a face. This made the note both useful and treacherous as evidence. It carried the promise of individuality while still permitting disguise. Every line seemed to say something about the author while refusing to settle what that something was. Was he foreign-born? Was he semi-literate? Was he pretending? Was he alone? Was he connected to organized crime? Was he trying to create that impression falsely? These questions were not academic. They would shape investigative energy, public suspicion, and the family's decisions in the days ahead, within the house. The first official and unofficial readings of the scene were inevitably colored by emotion. That is one of the difficult truths about crimes involving children and famous families. No one enters them as a neutral machine. The parents are terrified. Staff are shaken and self-protective. Police are conscious immediately that this is no ordinary call. Everyone understands that failure will be public, but before it is public, it is intimate. The crime scene is still full of the family's life. Lamps, furniture, clothing, hallways, stairs, a child's room. Evidence collection in such a setting is not just technical, it is an intrusion into heartbreak. Officers have to look where parents cannot bear to look, and yet the parents themselves may keep moving back toward the same places because emotion drives them there. In the Lindbergh case, this tension between urgency and preservation was acute from the beginning. The scene had to be read quickly because the child might still be recoverable, but the very speed required risked losing something irreplaceable. The house itself became almost symbolic in the first hours. It was no longer only the location of the offense. It was proof that seclusion had not protected the family. The high walls of privacy they had tried to build around themselves had been breached by someone willing to transform domestic architecture into opportunity. The nursery window was especially disturbing for this reason. Windows in a child's room are usually associated with light, air, and the mild poetry adults project onto childhood. A view of trees, a breeze in warmer months. Moonlight across the floor. In this case, the window became the reverse of all that. It was a wound in the house. An opening through which the outside world had reached into the family and taken from it. That symbolic reversal mattered not only emotionally, but investigatively. It made the second floor, which should have felt elevated and protected, seem suddenly vulnerable. It told the investigators that the offender had not needed a door, had not relied on invitation, and had not been stopped by height. He had turned the very structure of the house into an instrument. Some of the earliest clues were as notable for what they lacked as for what they contained. There was no immediate, obvious intruder identified by someone inside the home. There was no dramatic report of barking dogs, shattered confrontation, or loud commotion that might have fixed the time more precisely. The scene spoke through objects, not voices. That silence became part of the problem. Silent crimes leave too much room for narrative and not enough for certainty. People begin filling gaps almost instantly. And each gap in the Lindbergh case was enlarged by the family's fame, even before the investigation matured. Speculation began breeding around the evidence. The note seemed to suggest one kind of offender. The homemade ladder suggested another. The location of the house suggested deliberation. The absence of obvious witnesses suggested luck or familiarity. Each clue pointed, but not all in the same direction. The result was a crime scene that felt rich in significance and poor in immediate resolution. Yet the initial clues were still powerful enough to define the nature of the case for everyone involved. This was no accident. No domestic misunderstanding, no random wandering. It was a targeted kidnapping conducted with equipment, forethought, and a willingness to invade the most protected space in a private home, the child's removal from the crib. The ladder, the note, and the disturbed root beneath the nursery window formed a coherent picture of criminal action. That picture, grim as it was, became the foundation for everything that followed. It told the family that they were dealing with a kidnapper who expected payment and perhaps continued communication. It told the police that the offender had left physical evidence and probably more than he realized. Whether in handwriting, carpentry, route selection, or timing. It told the press, once the story escaped the estate, that the case had all the elements of a national sensation, and it told the country that one of its most admired families had been penetrated by a crime so intimate and so bold that ordinary measures of safety now felt inadequate. In the opening hours, of course, none of those broader meanings mattered as much to the Lindberghs as one unbearable practical question. Was Charles Jr. still alive? Every clue was read through that hope and fear together. The note seemed to keep hope open. The damaged ladder threatened hope. The silence after the abduction amplified fear. The crime scene became not just a set of facts, but a kind of emotional battleground between possible rescue and possible loss. That tension would define the case for weeks, but it began here, in the nursery and in the mud below the window, with the earliest signs that a stranger had climbed into a family's life and left behind just enough evidence to make terror structured, but not enough to make it stop.